Hi there, my name's Ben Storms and I'm the curator of the North American Gardens here at UBC Botanical Garden. In my role, I oversee 4 garden areas, each representing a diverse plant community from across North America. Today I'm going to share with you our Garry Oak Meadow. The Garry Oak Meadow Garden here at UBC Botanic Garden is a representation of the Garry Oak ecosystem, and that's a very unique plant community within the province that occurs just on the southern and southeastern kind of coastal regions of Vancouver Island and the associated islands in the Salish Sea. And it's a very biodiverse plant community within our province, and also very different than most of the typical conifer-dominated forest cover of the region. And it's home to some pretty incredible plants. One of them is the Quercus garryana, or Garry Oak. And you may have guessed, the ecosystem itself is named for this plant. But it is indeed far more than just this oak. There's a tremendous diversity of plants that live in this community. But the Garry Oak is quite interesting because it's the only oak found in British Columbia. And I say that's quite interesting because oaks are a very diverse group of plants across the world, and very dominant in terms of northern temperate forests. And very diverse in North America. You know, there are over 90 species of oak in North America, and yet just this one found here in British Columbia. The Garry Oaks grow on these coastal outcrops where these Garry Oak meadows occur, and in that situation they form sort of craggy, almost shrubby, scrub-like trees. But there are also Garry Oak meadows that occur on deep soils that are rich and can support large stature trees. And in that situation, this very same species will form a very large tree with quite a tall, wide, rounded canopy. The leaves on Garry Oak emerge quite late in the spring. And as a result, early in the spring, when abundant light is coming in, the soils have lots of moisture in them from our winter rains, and the heat starts to build up in the soils, the plants underneath grow very vigorously prior to the leaf emergence on Garry Oak. A very sort of iconic plant in these Garry Oak meadows is this, and this is called camas, or Camassia liclinii, specifically the great camas. There are a few different camas that grow in these meadows. And this plant grows from a bulb that is underground and produces these strap-like leaves early in the spring, and followed by this beautiful inflorescence of sort of rich indigo blue flowers. However, like many of the plants in these meadows, this is an ephemeral plant, meaning that it is not persistent above ground year-round. Like your tulips or daffodils or something like that, this plant will retreat to its underground bulb with the onset of summer heat and drought. This is a really interesting plant in that it has strong connections to a number of the indigenous cultures that live in the regions where Garry Oak meadows occur, and is an important food plant for them. However, there are very toxic plants in the meadow that could be easily confused with camas, particularly when they're not in bloom, so it's best not to harvest anything unless you're an expert. So this little plant here is one that I'm quite smitten with. It's called Castilleja levisecta, or the golden paintbrush. This plant is in the Orobanchaceae family, and like many members of that family, it's a parasitic plant. However, you'll notice that it does have green leaves, and therefore photosynthesizes and produces its own food. So it's really what we call a hemiparasitic plant, meaning that it produces its own food, but also draws energy reserves from host plants via its roots in this case. It produces these glowing sulfur yellow flowers early in the season, but it's a little bit deceptive because what you see here producing all of that color are actually bracts. They're modified leaves that are colored to entice pollinators. The flowers themselves are actually quite small and very inconspicuous, found nestled within the bract. This plant is a globally endangered plant that we've had quite a good success establishing in our meadow, and part of that is that we grow it with a host plant. As I mentioned, this is hemiparasitic. So the host plant that we grow this Castilleja with is this plant here, and this is called Romer's fescue. It's a bunching grass, perennial grass that grows in our meadows, produces these clumps of very, very fine leaves, and then these tall spikes of flowers that will later turn sort of a golden straw color. Together, they flourish in our meadow and create quite a beautiful scene. Another plant that you'll see featured prominently in our Garry Oak Meadow and in the Garry Oak Meadows in the wild is this plant here, and it's called Plectritis congesta, or pink sea blush. It's a member of the Caprifoliaceae family, also known as the honeysuckle family. And you might be more familiar with honeysuckles as shrubs or vines, but this plant here is actually an annual plant. It starts growing in the fall as a little seedling that then waits out our cool, moist winter wet. And then with the return of the spring sun and the warmth, it bolts forward very quickly to produce these large inflorescences of beautiful pink flowers. However, like the camas, it's also an ephemeral. But unlike the camas, which retreats underground to wait out the summer drought and heat, this plant here dies entirely. But before it does that, it produces copious amounts of seed. What we see here is actually the same plant a couple of weeks after flowering, and within a few weeks it will have ripened seeds that fall off this inflorescence to the Garry Oak Meadow floor, and they will wait out our summer drought as this seed, only to germinate again in the fall and start the process all over again. We've only had a chance to look at a few of the treasures that can be found in our meadow. However, there's all kinds of lovely plants to see in it. Typically, our meadow will reach its peak bloom in April through May, though there are lots of plants in there for interest and inspection throughout the year, and it always has a very distinctive character. You can explore our collections online by visiting botanicalgarden.ubc.ca/explorer.